In the bitter winter of 1944, as the flames of the Second World War raged across Europe, one city became the stage for a brutal and forgotten struggle, a siege so devastating that survivors would later call it Europe's hidden Stalingrad. The Siege of Budapest was not just another battle. It was a story of destruction, courage, and tragedy buried deep within the heart of Hungary's capital. 15-second hook picture this: frozen streets lined with shattered buildings, civilians hiding in basements, soldiers fighting from house to house, and tanks rumbling through narrow avenues. It was a city turned into a fortress, a last stand between Hitler's crumbling empire and the advancing Red Army. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel Forgotten WW2 Archives. Today, we're diving into one of the most harrowing and least discussed battles of the Second World War, the Siege of Budapest. Often overshadowed by Stalingrad and Berlin, this siege lasted from December 29, 1944 to February 13, 1945 and claimed over 200,000 lives. Both the German Wehrmacht and the Hungarian defenders fought desperately to hold off the Soviet onslaught, while hundreds of thousands of civilians were trapped in the crossfire. It's a chapter in history that reveals the horrors of urban warfare and the human cost of pride, politics, and desperation. As the Red Army approached Hungary in late 1944, Hitler refused to abandon Budapest. The city was not just strategically important, it was symbolic. Budapest controlled the route to Vienna and Germany's southern flank. Losing it would open the door to Central Europe. The German leader declared the city a fortress, or Festung Budapest, ordering the defenders to hold at all costs. Inside the city, German troops under SS General Karl Pfeffer-Walden Bruch and the remnants of the Hungarian army prepared for siege warfare. Meanwhile, Marshal Rodion Malinowski's Second Ukrainian Front surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and escape routes. The people of Budapest, once living in one of Europe's most beautiful capitals, now faced starvation, bombings, and fear. The Danube River, which divided the city into Buda and Pest, became a deadly front line. Soviet artillery shelled both banks relentlessly, reducing buildings to rubble. The Hungarian government, still loyal to Germany after a coup by the pro-Nazi Arrow Cross Party, forced its citizens to stay and fight. For many, there was no choice, only survival. Soldiers turned apartment blocks into fortresses. Civilians dug shelters beneath churches and theaters. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded as supplies ran out. Bread was replaced by horse meat, and water had to be collected from shell holes or melted snow. Outside, Soviet troops tightened their grip. The encirclement was complete by Christmas 1944. Thousands of German and Hungarian soldiers found themselves trapped inside the city, nearly 80,000 men against more than 180,000 Soviets. As snow covered the ruins, both sides prepared for a long and merciless battle. The Soviets wanted to capture Budapest before the new year as a gift to Stalin, while Hitler demanded it be held at any cost. The stage was set for one of the deadliest sieges in European history. Inside the besieged city, chaos reigned. The civilian population, numbering almost 800,000 before the siege, now struggled with hunger and fear. Hospitals ran out of medicine and corpses piled up in the streets. The Grand Parliament building, opera houses, and bridges became targets of artillery fire. Soldiers fought for every street corner, every staircase, every floor of every building. The city that once symbolized culture and beauty had turned into a battlefield of despair. By early January 1945, the Soviets had captured most of Pest, the eastern side of the Danube. The defenders retreated across the river, blowing up all but one of the bridges behind them. The remaining defenders now huddled on the hills of Buda, where German tanks and Hungarian troops prepared their last stand. The siege entered its bloodiest phase. The Red Army launched fierce assaults on Buda's defenses, determined to end the siege quickly. The hills around Castle District, Gellert Hill, and the royal palace turned into scenes of unimaginable destruction. Soviet tanks climbed steep roads under constant fire, while snipers from both sides hunted each other in the ruins. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ashes as artillery duels shook the ground day and night. Despite their exhaustion, the defenders continued to fight with ferocity. Many were young Hungarian soldiers barely in their 20s, driven by fear, loyalty, or sheer desperation. The German commander, General Pfeffer-Waldenbruch, repeatedly requested permission to withdraw, but Hitler refused. Budapest must hold, came the reply from Berlin. Reinforcements were promised but never arrived. Outside the city, German armored divisions tried multiple relief operations, known as Operation Conrad I, Roman II, and Roman III, a break through Soviet lines. They came close several times, even reaching within 20 kilometers of the city, but each attempt failed. Soviet defenses held firm, and the trapped garrison realized they were on their own. Inside Buda, conditions became unbearable. Civilians hid in cellars without food or light. The dead lay unburied, frozen in the streets. Hospitals were bombed, and the wounded died without care. The Arrow Cross militia, still loyal to the Nazi regime, committed atrocities against Jews and political prisoners. Thousands were executed or marched to their deaths along the Danube. The river became a silent witness to horror as bodies drifted through its icy waters. As January turned to February, the defenders' situation grew hopeless. Ammunition was almost gone. Soldiers fought with captured Soviet weapons or even hand grenades made from fuel cans. The royal palace, once a symbol of Hungary's monarchy, became the final bastion. Smoke rose from its domes as Soviet shells smashed through ancient walls. Inside, German and Hungarian troops fought room to room, refusing to surrender. Soviet loudspeakers blared messages urging them to lay down arms, but the defenders remained defiant. Then, on the night of February 11, 1945, General Pfeffer-Waldenbruch made a desperate decision. With no supplies left and the Soviets closing in, he ordered a breakout attempt. Thousands of soldiers and civilians tried to escape through the hills of Buda, hoping to reach German lines outside the city. It was chaos. Under a moonless sky, they charged through Soviet positions, only to be cut down by machine gun fire. Of the roughly 20 who attempted the breakout, fewer than 800 made it to safety. The rest were killed or captured. It was the tragic finale of a doomed defense. When the Soviets entered Buda on February 13, they found a city in ruins. Not a single bridge remained intact. Entire districts were flattened. The once majestic royal palace was gutted by fire. The Red Army claimed victory, but at a terrible cost. Tens of thousands of their soldiers lay dead among the ruins. The Germans and Hungarians lost nearly 40 men, and civilian casualties were catastrophic. The Siege of Budapest had lasted 102 days, longer than the Battle of Berlin, and was second only to Stalingrad in the ferocity of urban combat. The aftermath of the siege was haunting. The people who survived faced starvation, disease, and Soviet occupation. Budapest, once called the Paris of the East, had become a graveyard of its former self. Out of nearly 1 million residents before the siege, over 38,000 civilians perished, and countless others were left homeless. The Red Army's victory marked the end of Nazi control in Hungary, but it also opened a new chapter of Soviet domination that would last for decades. For historians, the Siege of Budapest remains a grim symbol of how war consumes both victors and victims alike. The German command's obsession with holding the city at any cost mirrored Hitler's madness in the final months of the war. The Hungarian soldiers' resistance showed both courage and tragedy, fighting for a lost cause under impossible conditions. Meanwhile, the Soviet soldiers who stormed the city endured unimaginable losses to capture it, many never returning home. Each side believed they were fighting for liberation or duty, but the city itself became the ultimate victim. In the post-war years, Hungary was forced into the Soviet sphere of influence. The memory of the siege was suppressed under communist rule, labeled as a liberation rather than a catastrophe. It wasn't until decades later that survivors began to tell their stories. The hunger, the bombings, the executions, and the sense of total despair. Today, memorials along the Danube, such as the shoes on the Danube bank, stand in silence for those who were murdered during that dark winter. Each shoe tells a story of loss, reminding the world of the civilians who paid the highest price. The Siege of Budapest teaches a painful lesson about the human cost of pride and ideology. It shows how ordinary people, civilians, soldiers, children, are swallowed by the machinery of war. In the grand strategy of generals and dictators, cities become chess pieces, but for those inside, every street becomes a battlefield of survival. The ruins of Budapest stood for years as a reminder of how close humanity came to destroying itself. When we look at the photographs of that time, the frozen Danube filled with debris, the skeletal remains of the royal palace, the faces of starving children, it's impossible not to see echoes of Stalingrad. Both cities endured unimaginable suffering, yet, unlike Stalingrad, Budapest's story faded into the shadows of history. That's why it's called Europe's hidden Stalingrad. So next time you walk through the restored streets of Budapest, beneath the shining domes and grand bridges, remember that beneath your feet lies the memory of one of Europe's darkest winters. The siege was not just a battle. It was a tragedy that revealed both the worst and the best of humanity, the cruelty of war and the resilience of the human spirit. And that's the story of the Siege of Budapest, the forgotten inferno in the heart of Europe. Thank you for watching Forgotten WW2 Archives. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from the world's deadliest war. Until next time, keep history alive and never forget the lessons it leaves behind.